The smell of something wrong. Leona Dorson had always wanted to make a difference. Fresh out of nursing school, the 25-year-old found herself in the hallways of Rosewood Medical Center, a large, bustling hospital with endless corridors and a ceaseless flow of patients. Unlike the small, friendly clinic where she'd interned, Rosewood's scale was overwhelming, and its pace was exhausting. Today was her first shift in the geriatric wing, filling in for another nurse on a temporary basis. As she pushed her cart through the antiseptic-scented hallways, she steeled herself, determined to prove she could handle it. Her first patient of the day was Clara Reynolds, an 87-year-old woman recovering from a severe bout of pneumonia. According to the file, Clara had a history of heart issues and mobility challenges, needing regular monitoring. The picture in her file showed a kind face, framed by graying curls. As Leona entered room 212, she didn't expect the sight that would greet her. The first thing that hit Leona wasn't what she saw, but what she smelled. A sharp, pungent odor, acrid and unnatural, cutting through the usual hospital scents. She wrinkled her nose, pausing at the doorway. The smell seemed to be coming from the bed, where Clara lay with her head turned toward the window, her back to the door. "Mrs. Reynolds," Leona called softly, taking a tentative step inside. Clara's shoulders twitched, and she slowly turned her head to face the young nurse. Her eyes, soft and brown, had a tinge of something deeper, something Leona recognized immediately as sadness and resignation. Clara gave a faint smile, but her frail hands were trembling slightly, clinging to the edge of her hospital gown. "Good morning, dear," Clara whispered, her voice raspy but kind. "It's always nice to see a new face." Leona smiled back, hiding her unease. As she stepped closer, she noticed yellow stains on Clara's gown, which seemed to be the source of the smell. Concern flickered through Leona's mind. This wasn't normal. "Mrs. Reynolds, let me help you change into a fresh gown." "Okay," Leona offered, moving closer. Clara's eyes darted away, and her fingers tightened on the fabric of her soiled gown. Her hesitation was palpable, and Leona's instincts kicked in. She'd seen this type of reaction before, in patients who felt vulnerable or embarrassed. "Don't worry, Mrs. Reynolds," Leona said gently. "I'm here to help you feel comfortable." As she began helping Clara change, Leona couldn't ignore the stains or the smell. The marks weren't just on her gown, but also on her thin, aged skin. She worked carefully, washing and wiping Clara down, all the while keeping up a gentle stream of conversation to ease her nerves. But Clara stayed silent, her eyes downcast, hands trembling slightly more with each movement. When Leona finally finished, she asked, "Do you know what happened, Mrs. Reynolds? How did these stains get here?" Clara took a shaky breath, and then glanced up at Leona with a look that made the nurse's heart tighten, a mixture of fear and shame, tinged with a sorrow that seemed to run deep. "It was the doctor," Clara murmured, so softly that Leona almost didn't hear it. Clara's hands clutched the new gown, her knuckles turning white. Leona blinked, her mind racing. Surely, she'd misunderstood. "The doctor?" she repeated, trying to keep her tone calm. Clara nodded, her gaze darting to the door, as if fearing someone might overhear. "Dr. Wallace," she whispered. He did this, said it was a necessary procedure. But he didn't. It wasn't right." Leona's pulse quickened. Dr. Wallace. He was one of the senior doctors, highly respected. She'd heard nurses speak about him with admiration. But Clara's tone, the way her body had tensed, something was wrong here. "Mrs. Reynolds," Leona said softly, her voice filled with concern. "Can you tell me exactly what happened?" Clara shook her head, her eyes filling with tears. "I can't. I'm just a burden here. I don't want to cause trouble." She looked down, her voice barely a whisper. "He said, people like me shouldn't expect special treatment." Leona's heart twisted at the words, and a chill ran down her spine. Clara's vulnerability, her fear, it spoke volumes, far more than she was willing to put into words. But Leona couldn't shake the image of this elderly woman, trembling and alone, afraid to speak up. "Mrs. Reynolds, you're not a burden," Leona assured her, fighting back her own surge of anger. "You deserve to be treated with respect. Please, if there's anything more you can tell me, I want to help." But Clara only shook her head, her lips pressed together tightly. Leona realized she wasn't going to get more from her, at least not yet. She finished helping Clara settle into bed and made a quiet promise to herself that she'd keep an eye on the situation. As Leona walked out of Clara's room, her mind was reeling. She needed to know more, but she was still new here, still finding her footing in this intimidating environment. But something deep inside her, a voice she'd long learned to trust, told her that this wasn't just her imagination. Clara's distress, her words about Dr. Wallace, the yellow stains, something was very wrong. Leona couldn't ignore it. She'd have to proceed carefully, but she was determined to find out the truth. Whispers of doubt. Leona spent the rest of her shift with a gnawing sense of unease. Every time she passed by Clara's room, she felt the pull to look in, to reassure herself that Clara was all right. But she resisted. She had her rounds to complete, and any obvious attention on one patient would raise eyebrows in a place like Rosewood. Still, her mind kept drifting back to Clara's whispered words, the way her hands had trembled, and the fear in her eyes. In the quiet of the nurse's station, as she organized patient charts, she couldn't help but replay their conversation. "He said people like me shouldn't expect special treatment." The words echoed in her mind, sending a chill down her spine every time she thought of them. Dr. Wallace was a respected figure here, one of the most senior physicians in the hospital. But as Leona had quickly learned in her nursing rotations, titles and reputations could be deceiving. As her shift drew to a close, Leona made a plan. She would reach out to one of her friends, Heron, who had worked at Rosewood for years and knew the ins and outs of the place. If anyone could give her insight into Dr. Wallace's reputation, it would be Karen. They arranged to meet at a small diner nearby after their shifts. The diner was a welcome change from the sterile halls of the hospital. The scent of coffee and warm pastries greeted Leona as she slid into a booth, exhausted but determined. Karen arrived a few minutes later, her curly brown hair tied back, her face showing the weariness of a double shift. She looked at Leona with raised eyebrows. "You look like you've seen a ghost," Karen said, sliding into the booth opposite her. "What's going on?" Leona hesitated, unsure how much to reveal. She didn't want to start rumors or get herself in trouble, but the sense of urgency pressed on her. She decided to choose her words carefully. "Do you know Dr. Wallace well?" she asked, keeping her tone casual. Karen's eyebrows shot up. "Dr. Wallace? Oh, I know him all right." She took a sip of her coffee, her expression turning grim. "Everyone here knows Dr. Wallace. He's got a bit of a reputation." Leona leaned forward, her heart pounding. "Reputation?" Karen sighed, glancing around the diner before lowering her voice. "Look, Dr. Wallace is respected, sure, but he's got his quirks. Let's just say he's not exactly known for his bedside manner. He can be abrupt, and sometimes he says things that rub people the wrong way." "What kind of things?" Leona pressed, her hands clenched around her coffee cup. Karen hesitated, choosing her words carefully. "He's got this old-school mentality, if you know what I mean. Thinks he's the authority on everything, doesn't like being questioned. And with some patients, well, let's just say he doesn't hide his biases." "Biases?" Leona's stomach tightened. Karen nodded, her expression serious. "Yeah, I've heard him make comments that are inappropriate, especially with some of our older patients, the ones who don't have families checking in on them regularly." She shook her head, sighing. "He picks on the ones he thinks won't fight back. I've heard him call patients a waste of resources before, and it's always the ones who don't fit his idea of who deserves care." Leona's mind raced. Everything Karen was saying lined up with Clara's quiet admission. If Dr. Wallace truly felt this way, he might have been doing more than simply neglecting her care. A wave of anger bubbled up in Leona's chest. She thought of Clara, lying in bed with that resigned, fearful expression, and her determination only grew stronger. "But he's so well respected," Leona said, struggling to understand how someone with such influence could be so careless. "How does he get away with it?" Karen shrugged. "People overlook things. He's been at Rosewood forever, and he's done some good work over the years. And to be fair, not everyone sees the side of him that you and I see. He's got his supporters." She leaned forward, her voice dropping to a near whisper. "But between you and me, I don't trust him. He's been untouchable for so long that he thinks he can do whatever he wants." Leona nodded, her resolve solidifying. "I have a patient," she began slowly, "an elderly woman named Clara Reynolds. She's scared of him. I noticed something was off, and she told me he hurt her, made her feel ashamed. I'm not sure what happened, but it doesn't sit right with me." Karen's expression grew solemn. "Be careful, Leona. Dr. Wallace doesn't like being challenged. If he finds out you're digging, it could cause trouble for you. He's got connections higher up, and he won't hesitate to make things difficult for you." Leona took a deep breath. "I don't know if I can just ignore it, Karen. I became a nurse to help people, and Clara deserves better than this." Karen reached across the table, placing a comforting hand on Leona's. "I get it, and I admire your courage. Just tread carefully. Document everything you see. If things get worse, you'll need proof." They sat in silence for a moment, each lost in their thoughts. Leona knew Karen was right. She had to be cautious, but she couldn't shake the feeling that if she didn't do something, Clara would continue to suffer in silence. The next morning, Leona arrived at the hospital with a plan. She would keep a close eye on Clara, document any unusual incidents, and, if necessary, report them. Her stomach twisted at the thought of confronting Dr. Wallace directly, but she reminded herself of Karen's advice. Stay calm, stay professional, and gather evidence. She made her way to Clara's room, bracing herself for whatever she might find. As she opened the door, the sight of Clara's pale face greeted her, the elderly woman's eyes widening with relief when she saw Leona. "Oh, thank goodness," Clara murmured, her voice barely a whisper. "You came back." Leona's heart softened. She pulled up a chair beside Clara's bed, placing a reassuring hand on her arm. "Of course, Mrs. Reynolds. I'll be here every day, taking care of you." Clara's eyes filled with tears, and she gave Leona a grateful nod. For a moment, they sat in silence, the trust between them growing. Leona knew this was her chance to learn more. "Mrs. Reynolds," Leona began carefully, "about yesterday. You mentioned that Dr. Wallace was the one who handled your care. Can you tell me a bit more about what happened?" Clara looked away, her hands trembling as they clutched the thin hospital blanket. He came in when I was alone," she whispered. "Said he was checking on me, but he didn't do anything kind. He looked at me like I was less than." She swallowed, her voice growing strained. "He made me feel small, like I didn't deserve to be here." Leona's fists clenched at her sides. She kept her voice soft. "What did he do, Mrs. Reynolds?" Clara's hands tightened around the blanket, her knuckles white. "He pushed me. He spilled that bottle, the one you cleaned up. He made me sit there, humiliated, and then he said I should be grateful for what I get." A surge of anger filled Leona, her usually calm demeanor barely containing her outrage. "That's unacceptable, Mrs. Reynolds. No one should treat you that way." Clara looked at her, hope flickering in her weary eyes. "I didn't want to say anything, dear. I didn't want to cause trouble. I thought no one would believe me." Leona squeezed her hand gently. "I believe you, Mrs. Reynolds, and I'm going to do everything I can to make sure you're treated with the respect you deserve." The words seemed to bring Clara a small measure of comfort, and she gave a faint nod. "Thank you, Leona. You don't know how much this means to me." As Leona left Clara's room, she felt a fierce sense of purpose. She would gather the evidence she needed, watch over Clara, and document every moment that raised a red flag. She didn't care about Dr. Wallace's influence or his connections. She cared about doing the right thing. In the days that followed, Leona kept a careful eye on Clara, recording each interaction, each whispered comment, and each act of negligence she witnessed. But as her notes grew, so did her apprehension. She knew she was walking a dangerous line, but she couldn't shake the feeling that she was uncovering something far darker than she'd anticipated. Every time she saw Dr. Wallace in the hallway, she felt his gaze on her, cold and unyielding. And then, one evening, as Leona was leaving her shift, she found a note tucked into her locker. "Stay out of this if you know what's good for you." Her heart pounded as she stared at the words, written in harsh, unfamiliar handwriting. But instead of scaring her off, it only strengthened her resolve. She couldn't let fear control her, not when Clara's well-being was at stake. Taking a deep breath, Leona folded the note and tucked it into her pocket. She knew the risks, but she wasn't going to back down. This was a fight she hadn't chosen, but now that she was in it, she would see it through. The quiet battle begins. Leona Dorson felt the weight of her decision press down on her as she returned to her shift the next day. The note she'd received had been cryptic, but clear, a warning, or maybe even a threat. But despite the anxiety that simmered in her chest, she couldn't bring herself to turn away. Clara Reynolds was relying on her, and Leona couldn't live with herself if she abandoned the elderly woman to the cold, dismissive care of Dr. Wallace. Clara had been through too much already, and Leona could see that even the slightest kindness was a balm to her spirit. It was more than just the medical care. It was about preserving her dignity, her humanity. That morning, as Leona entered the hospital, she resolved to tread carefully. She would need evidence, clear, undeniable proof of the doctor's negligence or abuse. A single nurse's word against a respected physician wouldn't hold much weight. But if she could gather enough observations, enough small incidents that added up to a pattern, then maybe, just maybe, someone would take her concerns seriously. Her plan was simple. She would document every interaction Dr. Wallace had with Clara. She'd write down his exact words, record his attitude, and note any comments or actions that raised alarms. Over time, the small observations might build into something that couldn't be ignored. As she made her way to Clara's room, she prepared herself mentally. Today would be the beginning of her quiet investigation. When Leona entered, Clara was sitting up in bed, her frail form looking even smaller against the stark white sheets. Her hands rested on her lap, and she looked up with a faint smile when she saw Leona. "Oh, you came back," Clara said softly, relief washing over her features. Leona felt her heart warm at the woman's gentle words. "Of course I did, Mrs. Reynolds. How are you feeling today?" Clara's eyes shifted down to her hands, and her smile faded slightly. "It's been quiet. They've kept to themselves this morning. No doctors coming in to check on me, not since early yesterday." Her voice held a note of sadness. Leona clenched her jaw. Patients like Clara often fell through the cracks, their care overlooked because they were considered low priority. It wasn't that they were necessarily neglected, but the lack of attention showed in small ways: missed medication times, delays in personal care, or, as Clara had experienced, indifference or hostility from caregivers who should have known better. But today, Leona would make sure Clara received the care she deserved. She began her rounds, checking Clara's vital signs, asking her questions about her comfort, and gently encouraging her to share anything that might be troubling her. "Has Dr. Wallace been by recently?" Leona asked carefully as she took Clara's pulse. Clara's expression darkened, and she shook her head. "He came by yesterday morning. Said he was too busy to waste time on the likes of me." Her voice was barely above a whisper, laced with a pain that seemed older than this hospital visit. "He didn't even look at me while he said it." Leona's hand stilled, her heart pounding. She wrote down Clara's words as soon as she left the room, her handwriting shaky with anger. She couldn't believe that a doctor, someone sworn to do no harm, would speak to a patient that way. But she knew she needed more than just Clara's account if she was going to bring this to light. The following days passed with a tense rhythm. Leona continued her observations, each day noting small acts of neglect or disdain that could easily be dismissed as mistakes or oversights. She documented everything: the late medication administrations, the dismissive remarks, the subtle looks of annoyance from Dr. Wallace whenever he interacted with Clara. Piece by piece, she was building a case. But Leona knew she'd need to confront Dr. Wallace eventually. If nothing else, she wanted him to know that someone was watching, that someone cared. The thought both terrified and invigorated her. He was a senior doctor, respected, with years of experience and influence. She was just a temporary nurse with no real power. But that didn't change what she knew was right. One afternoon, as Leona made her way to the nurse's station to file her latest notes, she overheard two nurses talking quietly near the supply closet. "Have you seen the way Dr. Wallace handles his low-priority patients?" One of them, a woman named Sylvia, whispered. "I swear, he barely even glances at them." "Tell me about it," the other nurse, Karen, replied with a sigh. "He's all smiles and charm with the high-profile cases, but if you're old or don't have any family checking up on you, he acts like you don't exist." Leona's ears perked up. She approached them, hoping her curiosity didn't come off as too eager. "I couldn't help but overhear," she said softly. "Have you noticed anything unusual with Dr. Wallace's treatment of his patients?" The two nurses exchanged a glance, and Karen looked around before leaning in. "If you're asking about Mrs. Reynolds, you're not the only one who's noticed. He's harsher with her, you know. It's like he's got a grudge against her for no reason. I've heard him say things that'd get anyone else fired." Sylvia nodded in agreement. "It's not just her either. There are a few others, usually older patients without family around. He acts like they're a waste of his time." She shook her head, a look of disgust crossing her face. "Honestly, it's only because he's so connected that he's still here. Nobody wants to risk their job by saying anything." Leona's suspicions were validated. She thanked them both, feeling a renewed determination. There were more people who'd seen what she had, people who cared but were too afraid to act. But Leona was different. She wasn't tied to Rosewood, and she wasn't willing to let Clara, or anyone else, suffer in silence. That evening, Leona waited by Clara's room, hoping for a chance to see Dr. Wallace in action. Sure enough, as she was adjusting a pillow for Clara, she heard the familiar heavy footsteps down the hall. She glanced at Clara, who immediately looked away, her shoulders tensing. Dr. Wallace entered the room, his expression as indifferent as ever. He didn't acknowledge Leona, his eyes landing on Clara with that same cold, disdainful look that Leona had come to recognize. "Mrs. Reynolds," he said curtly, as if the words themselves were an inconvenience. "You're still here, I see. I thought you'd be discharged by now." Clara didn't respond, and Leona fought to keep her own expression neutral, her hands clenching behind her back. Dr. Wallace moved closer to the bed, taking a clipboard and making notes without once looking at Clara. "Your progress is slow. At this rate, we might as well consider other options." Leona felt a flash of anger. Other options? The implication was clear, but she bit her tongue, knowing any reaction could jeopardize her efforts to observe and document. "What do you mean by other options?" she asked, her voice as calm as she could manage. Dr. Wallace glanced at her, a flicker of annoyance in his eyes. "I mean that Mrs. Reynolds might be better suited to a long-term care facility. This hospital is not a place to linger when there are people who genuinely need care waiting for a bed." Leona felt Clara's hand tremble under her own, and she squeezed it gently, offering silent reassurance. She knew Clara had nowhere else to go. A long-term care facility would be the last place she'd want to end up. With a forced calm, Leona replied, "Mrs. Reynolds is recovering steadily, and her vitals have shown consistent improvement. There's no reason to push for an early discharge unless her health requires it." Dr. Wallace's gaze hardened, and Leona could see the flicker of a challenge in his eyes. "And who are you to make that determination?" he asked, his tone laced with barely concealed contempt. "You're a temporary nurse, here for a few shifts. Leave the medical decisions to those who are qualified." Leona held her ground, her voice steady. "I am her nurse today, doctor, and my job is to advocate for my patients. Mrs. Reynolds has the right to fair treatment and respect." Dr. Wallace's eyes narrowed, his lips curling into a smirk. "Respect? Look around, nurse. This is a hospital, not a charity. Patients like Mrs. Reynolds should be grateful for what they receive here. Some of us don't have the luxury of coddling every person who walks through these doors." Clara's eyes filled with tears, and Leona's heart twisted. She couldn't believe the cruelty in his words. But this was the proof she needed, a tangible example of his attitude, of the disregard and contempt he harbored for patients like Clara. "Thank you for your perspective, doctor," Leona said, her voice tight but controlled. "I'll continue to document Mrs. Reynolds' care and ensure she receives the support she needs." Dr. Wallace gave her one last, contemptuous look before turning on his heel and leaving the room. As soon as he was gone, Clara let out a shaky breath, her shoulders sagging. "Oh, Leona," she murmured, "you don't know what it means to have someone speak up for me. I thought no one cared." Leona knelt by her bedside, taking Clara's hands in her own. "I care, Mrs. Reynolds, and I promise you, I'm not letting this go. You deserve better, and I'll do everything I can to make sure you get it." As Leona left Clara's room, she knew the road ahead would be difficult. Dr. Wallace wasn't just any doctor. He was powerful, respected, and vindictive. But she couldn't let fear stop her now. The time for subtlety was over. She was ready to escalate her findings and take this to someone who could make a difference. The next steps would require bravery, resilience, and the willingness to challenge a broken system. And Leona knew that, whatever happened, she wouldn't be standing alone. For Clara, and for every other patient who'd been overlooked, she was ready to fight, gathering allies and uncovering truths. Leona spent the rest of that week carefully documenting every incident involving Dr. Wallace, noting his hostile remarks and negligent treatment. But with each entry in her logbook, she grew increasingly aware that she couldn't do this alone. Confronting someone as influential as Dr. Wallace would require more than her words on a piece of paper. She needed allies, people within Rosewood who shared her concerns and would be willing to support her when the time came to act. Her first thought was to reach out to Karen, the nurse she'd confided in earlier. But Karen had made it clear she didn't want to risk her position. She hinted at knowing more than she'd let on, but Leona couldn't push her too hard without putting her friend in an uncomfortable position. As Leona pondered her next move, she remembered a nurse she'd met during her orientation, Angela Martinez, a respected figure in Rosewood's nursing staff. Angela was known for her fierce advocacy for patients and her willingness to speak out when something wasn't right. Leona decided that if anyone would understand the importance of what she was doing, it would be Angela. The opportunity to speak with Angela came during a night shift, when the hospital was quieter than usual. Angela was stationed at the nurse's desk, sorting through patient files with a focused expression. Leona took a deep breath, steadying herself as she approached. "Angela, do you have a moment?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Angela looked up, her eyes warm and attentive. "Of course, Leona. What's on your mind?" Leona hesitated, glancing around to make sure no one else was listening. She knew this was a gamble. Angela was well respected, but if she didn't agree with what Leona was doing, it could spell trouble. But something in Angela's gaze reassured her. I have concerns about one of my patients, Mrs. Clara Reynolds," Leona began carefully. "She's in Dr. Wallace's care, and I've noticed things that don't sit right with me." Angela's expression didn't change, but Leona noticed a subtle shift in her posture, a slight stiffening of her shoulders. "Go on," Angela said, her voice calm but intense. Leona took another deep breath and shared everything she had observed. The condescending remarks, the neglect, and the humiliation Clara had endured. She also mentioned the note she'd found in her locker, the anonymous warning that had only strengthened her resolve to act. Angela listened intently, her face growing more serious with each detail. When Leona finished, Angela was silent for a moment, her gaze distant as if lost in thought. "You're not the first to notice these things about Dr. Wallace," Angela said finally, her voice low and controlled. "He's been here for years, and many of us have seen his questionable behavior with patients he deems unworthy of his attention. But he's protected by his position and by the fact that he brings in wealthy patients who donate heavily to the hospital. His connections go all the way to the top." Leona's heart sank, but she refused to let go of her determination. "Angela, I can't just ignore this. Clara doesn't have anyone else looking out for her. I've been documenting everything, but I don't know if that's enough. I need help." Angela nodded slowly, her eyes thoughtful. "If you're serious about this, you're going to need more than just documentation. You'll need witnesses, other staff members who've seen his behavior firsthand and are willing to speak up. It's risky, but it might be the only way." Leona felt a surge of hope. Do you think anyone else would be willing to help?" Angela gave her a faint smile. "There are a few who might. I'll talk to some people I trust. But Leona, you need to understand that if you go through with this, it could cost you your job, especially since you're just a temporary nurse here. And Dr. Wallace won't take this lying down. He's not above retaliating." Leona swallowed hard, the weight of Angela's words settling over her. She knew the risks, but she also knew that she couldn't turn back now. "I understand. Thank you, Angela. I don't want to put anyone in danger, but if anyone is willing to stand with me, I'd be grateful." Angela's expression softened. "You're brave, Leona. Not many would take on someone like Dr. Wallace, especially for a patient with no family or power. I'll see what I can do." They exchanged a nod, a silent understanding passing between them. Leona left the nurse's desk with a renewed sense of purpose. She knew the road ahead would be difficult, but Angela's support gave her the strength to keep going. The following days were a whirlwind of quiet conversations and careful planning. True to her word, Angela spoke to a few trusted staff members, gauging their willingness to support Leona's cause. Some expressed fear, unwilling to risk their positions or cross Dr. Wallace, but a handful of others, who had seen his behavior firsthand, agreed to back Leona if it came down to it. One of these allies was Dr. Ravi Patel, a junior doctor in the cardiology department. Dr. Patel was soft-spoken and reserved, but he had a strong moral compass and had been troubled by Dr. Wallace's treatment of patients for years. Leona approached him one evening in the break room, and after a quiet conversation, he agreed to speak up if necessary. "I've been wanting to report him for a long time," Dr. Patel confided, his voice filled with frustration. "But every time I thought about it, I'd hear about another doctor getting pushed out for stepping on the wrong toes. The administration protects people like Dr. Wallace, and the rest of us just have to keep our heads down." Leona nodded in understanding, feeling a surge of solidarity. "Thank you, Dr. Patel. Having you on our side means a lot. We'll need everyone we can get." In the meantime, Leona continued her work with Clara, who seemed to sense that something was shifting. Clara's spirits had improved slightly, and she seemed less fearful when Leona was around, though the trauma of her previous interactions with Dr. Wallace was still evident in her guarded expressions and tense posture. One afternoon, as Leona was helping Clara with her lunch, Clara reached out and placed a trembling hand over Leona's. "I know you're doing something for me, dear," Clara whispered, her eyes filling with gratitude. "I don't know what it is, but thank you. You're the first person who's made me feel seen in a long time." Leona's throat tightened. "You don't need to thank me, Mrs. Reynolds. It's what you deserve. And I promise you, we're going to make sure you get the care and respect you're owed." Clara nodded, her expression a mixture of relief and hope. For the first time, Leona saw a glimmer of the strong, resilient woman Clara must have once been. a woman who had lived through hardships and survived, despite the challenges life had thrown at her. Finally, the day arrived when Leona knew she would have to confront Dr. Wallace directly. She gathered enough evidence and had several staff members willing to testify to his behavior, but she also knew that a confrontation would be risky. Dr. Wallace would likely try to discredit her, and there was no guarantee the hospital administration would take her side. Leona's opportunity came unexpectedly. She was walking down the corridor, heading to the supply room, when she spotted Dr. Wallace at the nurse's desk, reviewing a chart with a scowl on his face. Her heart pounded, but she knew this might be her only chance to speak with him alone. She approached him, her footsteps steady and her expression calm. "Dr. Wallace, may I have a word with you?" He looked up, his gaze cold and unwelcoming. "What is it, Nurse Dorson?" "I'm busy." Leona took a deep breath, her hands clenched at her sides. "It's about Mrs. Reynolds. I believe she deserves better treatment than what she's been receiving." Dr. Wallace's eyes narrowed, and he let out a derisive snort. "Is that so? And who are you to make such judgments, Nurse Dorson? You're a temporary nurse here, nothing more. Do you think you know more about patient care than I do?" Leona held her ground, refusing to be intimidated. "I may be temporary, Dr. Wallace, but that doesn't mean I don't care about my patients. Mrs. Reynolds deserves dignity and respect, just like any other patient. She shouldn't be made to feel like a burden simply because she doesn't fit your idea of who deserves care." Dr. Wallace's expression darkened, and he took a step closer, his voice a low, threatening growl. "Listen to me, nurse. I've been here long enough to know how things work. Patients like Mrs. Reynolds are a drain on resources, plain and simple. We're a hospital, not a charity. If you want to keep your job, I suggest you keep your opinions to yourself." Leona felt a surge of anger, but she forced herself to remain calm. "Threatening me won't change the truth, Dr. Wallace. I've documented everything, and I'm not the only one who's noticed your behavior. Others have seen it too, and they're willing to come forward." For the first time, Leona saw a flicker of doubt in Dr. Wallace's eyes, but it was quickly replaced by a cold, calculating look. "Do what you want, Nurse Dorson, but don't think for a second that anyone will believe you over me. I've been here for decades and I have friends in high places. You, on the other hand, are expendable." With that, he turned and walked away, leaving Leona standing alone, her heart pounding with a mixture of fear and determination. She knew he was right about one thing. He had powerful allies, and going up against him wouldn't be easy. But she also knew that she couldn't back down now. As she watched him disappear down the corridor, Leona took a deep breath, steadying herself. She would take this fight to the administration, armed with her documentation and the testimonies of those who'd agreed to stand by her. Dr. Wallace's power didn't intimidate her. It only fueled her resolve to see this through. For Clara, and for every other patient who had suffered in silence, Leona was ready to face whatever came next. A call for justice. Leona could feel the weight of the task ahead, heavier than anything she'd experienced before. She was no longer simply a nurse caring for patients. She was an advocate, a voice against injustice, and the person standing between Clara Reynolds and a system that seemed intent on ignoring her suffering. The day after her confrontation with Dr. Wallace, Leona found herself standing outside the office of Rosewood's hospital administrator, Mr. Gerald Connors. Connors was known for his no-nonsense attitude and his unwavering loyalty to the hospital's reputation. That reputation had kept him in his position for over 2 decades, and he was someone not easily swayed. But Leona knew she had no other choice. She took a deep breath, knocked on the door, and waited. "Come in," a gruff voice called out. Leona stepped inside, clutching her stack of meticulously documented notes, each page filled with dates, times, and descriptions of the incidents she'd witnessed. Connors looked up from his desk, adjusting his glasses as he gave her a curt nod. "Ms. Dorson, what can I help you with?" he asked, his voice devoid of any warmth. "I hope you understand my schedule is quite full today, so let's keep this brief." Leona steeled herself, her gaze unwavering. "Mr. Connors, I'm here because of serious concerns I have about Dr. Wallace's treatment of his patients, specifically Mrs. Clara Reynolds." Connors raised an eyebrow, his fingers tapping impatiently on his desk. "Dr. Wallace, he's one of our most respected physicians. You must realize that accusing someone of his stature is a serious matter." "I do," Leona replied, her voice steady. "And I wouldn't be here if it weren't important. Over the past few weeks, I've documented numerous instances of neglect, verbal abuse, and outright mistreatment by Dr. Wallace. He's repeatedly shown disdain toward patients like Mrs. Reynolds, referring to her and others as a drain on resources and making them feel as though they don't deserve to be here." She placed her notes on Connors's desk, each sheet carefully arranged. Connors stared at them for a moment, his face expressionless. He glanced down and began flipping through the pages, his brow furrowing as he skimmed the contents. Leona could see a glimmer of irritation on his face, but she pressed on. "This isn't just a matter of one patient's experience," she continued. "Several other staff members have observed similar behavior, and they're willing to speak up if necessary. Dr. Wallace's actions are putting vulnerable patients at risk, and it's not only unethical, it's dangerous." Connors looked up, his expression skeptical. "You mentioned other staff members. Are they willing to come forward officially? Because I'll tell you right now, accusations without concrete support won't get very far." Leona nodded. "Yes, sir. I've spoken with Nurse Angela Martinez, Dr. Ravi Patel, and a few others who have witnessed Dr. Wallace's behavior. They're willing to support these claims, even if it means risking their own positions." At the mention of other staff, Connor's expression hardened. "And what do you expect me to do, Ms. Dorson? This hospital relies on the work of doctors like Dr. Wallace. Reputations aside, he brings in a lot of donations through his high-profile patients. Firing him would mean financial repercussions that this hospital might not be able to afford." Leona felt a surge of frustration. "Mr. Connors, this isn't just about money. This is about patient safety and dignity. Mrs. Reynolds deserves respect and proper care, just like any other patient. Allowing someone like Dr. Wallace to continue unchecked not only undermines our profession, but endangers people's lives." Connors leaned back in his chair, crossing his arms. "Do you understand how difficult it would be to build a case strong enough to justify disciplinary action against a doctor with Dr. Wallace's tenure? And even if I were inclined to pursue this, the board would need more than just observations and a handful of complaints." Leona's heart sank. She'd feared this response, but had hoped that her documentation and the testimonies of other staff members would be enough. She opened her mouth to respond, but Connors held up a hand, silencing her. "Ms. Dorson, I appreciate your dedication to patient care. I truly do," he said, though his tone suggested otherwise. "But sometimes we have to weigh the greater good. Dr. Wallace brings in revenue, which helps fund care for patients who might not otherwise be able to afford it. I'm not saying his behavior is acceptable, but we need to be pragmatic." Leona stared at him, disbelief flooding her veins. "Pragmatic? So you're saying that as long as he brings in money, it doesn't matter if he treats patients like they're less than human?" Connors gave her a tight-lipped smile, his eyes cold. "I'm saying that life is full of compromises, Ms. Dorson, and sometimes sacrifices have to be made." Leona felt a flash of anger, but she bit back her response. She knew pushing him further wouldn't get her anywhere. Instead, she took a deep breath, letting the disappointment settle. "Thank you for your time, Mr. Connors," she said, her voice calm and controlled. "But I won't stop fighting for Mrs. Reynolds or any other patient who's been treated unfairly. And if the hospital won't protect them, I'll find someone who will." With that, she turned and left the office, her hand shaking as she closed the door behind her. She felt defeated, but not broken. Connor's response had made one thing clear. If she wanted to bring justice to Clara and others like her, she would have to take this fight outside the walls of Rosewood. That evening, Leona sat at her small kitchen table, Flipping through her notes, her mind racing. She'd heard stories of other nurses who had gone public with their concerns, bringing attention to negligence and abuse in healthcare facilities. She knew it wouldn't be easy. She'd be putting her career, her reputation, and even her personal life on the line. But the memory of Clara's trembling hands, her quiet fear, and the anguish in her eyes wouldn't let her rest. She considered contacting a local journalist, someone who might be interested in exposing the truth. There was a small newspaper, the Rosewood Tribune, that often published stories about local issues, including healthcare and social justice. It wasn't a large paper, but it was respected, and she knew that sometimes the smaller publications had a greater impact than the big news outlets. The next morning, Leona made the call. She contacted the Rosewood Tribune and asked to speak to someone about a potential story. After a few moments of holding, she was connected to a journalist named Sarah Collins, who listened patiently as Leona explained the situation. "Thank you for reaching out, Leona," Sarah said, her voice kind but firm. "If what you're saying is true, this is definitely something we'd be interested in covering. But we'll need evidence, solid proof of Dr. Wallace's behavior, and preferably statements from other staff members who can corroborate your story." Leona nodded, even though Sarah couldn't see her. "I have documentation, notes from every incident I've observed, and a few of my colleagues have agreed to support me. They've seen his behavior too." Sarah was silent for a moment, and Leona could sense her weighing the risks. "This could be a powerful story, Leona. But you need to be aware that going public might bring serious consequences. If the hospital decides to retaliate, they could try to discredit you or even blacklist you from other healthcare jobs. Are you prepared for that?" Leona's throat tightened, but she pushed the fear aside. "I know the risks, and I'm ready to face them. I can't stand by and let this continue." Sarah's tone softened. "You're a brave woman, Leona. I'll do everything I can to help you. Let's meet tomorrow at a cafe near the hospital. I'll bring a recorder, and we'll go over your notes in detail. If this story is as strong as it sounds, I'll make sure it reaches the right people." They arranged a time, and Leona hung up, feeling a strange mixture of fear and exhilaration. This was it, the point of no return. She would be putting herself in the spotlight, and there was no telling what the hospital might do in response. But the thought of Clara's suffering, of all the other patients who might be enduring the same treatment, steeled her resolve. The next day, Leona met with Sarah at a quiet cafe a few blocks from the hospital. She brought her notes, a stack of carefully documented incidents, and the names of staff members who'd agreed to support her. Sarah listened attentively, occasionally asking questions, and as the interview continued, Leona felt a weight lifting from her shoulders. For the first time, she felt like someone was truly listening, someone who cared about justice as much as she did. As they wrapped up, Sarah gave her a reassuring smile. "This is powerful, Leona. I think your story will resonate with people. But remember, once it's out there, you can't take it back. Be prepared for backlash." Leona nodded, her jaw set. "I am. As long as it brings change, it's worth it." 2 days later, the story appeared on the front page of the Rosewood Tribune, under the headline, **** Neglect and Abuse in Rosewood Hospital. The Ripple Effect. The day after the story broke, Rosewood Hospital felt like a powder keg. Staff whispered in hallways, glancing at Leona with a mixture of admiration and apprehension. She had done what many considered unthinkable. She'd gone public, exposing the abuses hidden behind the hospital's polished exterior. The headline, "Neglect and Abuse in Rosewood Hospital. A Nurse Speaks Out Against Injustice," had sparked a wildfire of attention, and the story was quickly picked up by larger outlets. Overnight, Leona had gone from an anonymous nurse to a public advocate for vulnerable patients everywhere. Her phone buzzed constantly with messages, supportive texts from friends and family, calls from reporters seeking further comments, and even a few voicemails from former patients who wanted to thank her for speaking out. But along with the praise, there were darker messages. Anonymous texts warned her to stay in her lane, and not bite the hand that feeds her. She knew some of these threats could be from hospital insiders, people loyal to Dr. Wallace, or just afraid of the hospital losing its funding and reputation. But despite the fear, Leona's resolve remained unshaken. The hospital administration, predictably, had called for an emergency meeting. Leona was summoned, along with a few of the staff members who had supported her. Angela, Dr. Patel, and 2 other nurses stood by her side as they filed into the large, imposing boardroom, where Mr. Connors and other high-ranking members of the hospital's board sat waiting. The air was tense, thick with unspoken accusations and simmering anger. Mr. Connors, looking more severe than usual, motioned for them to sit. His eyes bore into Leona, filled with a barely contained fury. "Ms. Dorson," he began, his voice cold, "do you have any idea of the chaos you've caused with your story?" Leona met his gaze, refusing to flinch. "With all due respect, Mr. Connors, the chaos was caused by Dr. Wallace's actions, not by my decision to expose them. Patients were suffering, and the hospital was ignoring it. I did what I thought was right." He scoffed, shaking his head. "This is beyond what we would expect from any nurse in our facility. You could have come to us directly." "I did come to you, Mr. Connors," Leona replied, her voice steady. "I brought you documentation. I shared my concerns. You dismissed them, saying sacrifices had to be made. Clara Reynolds was not a sacrifice I was willing to make." Connors clenched his jaw, his fingers tapping rhythmically on the table. "So you thought it wise to drag this hospital's name through the mud, to put your personal feelings above the institution." Leona felt a swell of frustration, but she kept her tone calm. "Mr. Connors, this isn't about my feelings. It's about patients who were being neglected and mistreated. It's about holding people accountable, no matter how powerful they are." Beside her, Angela and Dr. Patel gave her subtle nods of support. Connors noticed, his gaze shifting to each of them with a look of disdain. "Dr. Patel, Nurse Martins, and the rest of you," he said, addressing her allies, "I hope you realize the position you're putting yourselves in by aligning with this disruption." Angela spoke up, her voice calm and resolute. "With all due respect, sir, we're standing up for what's right. We've witnessed Dr. Wallace's behavior, and it has no place in this hospital. Patients deserve better." Dr. Patil added, "Healthcare is about compassion, dignity, and respect. If we turn a blind eye to mistreatment, we're failing in our duty as caregivers." Connors's face reddened, his control beginning to slip. "This is outrageous. Do you all realize the financial hit the hospital will take because of this? Donations will drop, patients will look elsewhere, and the reputation we've built over decades will be tarnished, all because of your baseless accusations." "Baseless," Leona countered, her voice rising. "We have documentation. We have testimonies from staff who witnessed Dr. Wallace's actions. And now, the public knows. It's not baseless. It's the truth." A heavy silence fell over the room, broken only by the tense, rhythmic tapping of Connors's fingers. Finally, he sighed, the fight draining from his posture as he seemed to accept that they were at a standoff. "Very well," he said, his voice bitter. "The hospital will conduct an internal investigation. Dr. Wallace will be placed on temporary leave, effective immediately. However, I warn you all, if this investigation finds that your claims are exaggerated or unfounded, there will be consequences." Leona didn't back down, her chin held high. "All we ask for is an honest investigation, Mr. Connors, and I'm confident it will reveal the truth." Over the next several days, the hospital was in a state of upheaval. Dr. Wallace was formally suspended, and the administration scrambled to conduct interviews, gather evidence, and control the damage that Leona's story had caused. Meanwhile, public interest in the case grew. Reporters camped outside the hospital, waiting to interview staff members and even former patients who had come forward with their own stories of mistreatment under Dr. Wallace's care. Leona was cautious during this period. choosing her words carefully and keeping a low profile. Despite her newfound attention, she still showed up for her shifts, caring for her patients with the same compassion and dedication as before. The support from the community kept her going, and she found strength in the kind words from strangers who reached out to thank her for her courage. One afternoon, as Leona was leaving the hospital, she noticed a familiar figure waiting near the entrance. Clara Reynolds sat in a wheelchair, looking frail but determined, with a younger woman by her side. Clara's eyes lit up when she saw Leona, and she waved her over. "Leona, dear," Clara called. Her voice warmed despite the strain. Leona hurried over, her heart swelling with emotion. "Mrs. Reynolds, I didn't expect to see you here. How are you?" Clara took her hand, squeezing it tightly. "I'm doing better, thanks to you. This is my granddaughter, Lena." She flew in from across the country when she heard what happened. Lena, a tall woman with kind eyes, nodded gratefully. "Thank you, Leona. I didn't know about everything my grandmother had been going through. You've done more for her than we can ever repay." Leona felt tears prick her eyes. "I just did what I thought was right. Your grandmother deserves respect, just like anyone else." Clara's eyes shone with pride. "You saved me, Leona. Not just physically, but you reminded me that I matter. You reminded me that I'm not invisible." They shared a long hug, each drawing strength from the other. In that moment, Leona knew that whatever happened, whatever consequences she might face, it was all worth it. Clara's dignity had been restored, and she knew that no one would ever silence her again. A month passed, and the hospital's internal investigation concluded. The findings were damning. Dr. Wallace was found to have repeatedly violated ethical guidelines, mistreating patients based on his personal biases and ignoring his duty of care. The board had no choice but to terminate his employment, a decision that made headlines across the city. For Leona, the news was bittersweet. She was relieved that justice had been served, but the ordeal had taken its toll. Rosewood Hospital's administration was still cold toward her, and she sensed that her days there were numbered. She'd become a liability, a reminder of the scandal that had rocked their institution. But Leona wasn't alone. In the wake of the investigation, she received several job offers from other hospitals and clinics, institutions that valued her integrity and courage. She chose a smaller community hospital, one known for its commitment to patient-centered care. It was a fresh start, a place where she could continue her work without fear of retribution. On her last day at Rosewood, Angela, Dr. Patel, and several other colleagues gathered to bid her farewell. They shared heartfelt words, expressing their admiration and gratitude for her bravery. As she hugged Angela goodbye, the older nurse smiled. "You've changed this place, Leona. Because of you, patients like Clara won't be overlooked anymore. Don't ever doubt the impact you've made." Leona left Rosewood with her head held high, proud of the fight she'd fought. She knew there would always be challenges in healthcare, always be injustices to confront. But she'd learned that standing up, even when it seemed impossible, could spark change. Months later, Leona received a handwritten letter in the mail. She opened it to find a note from Clara, written in delicate cursive. "Dear Leona, thank you for seeing me when others didn't. You gave me back my voice, and I will always be grateful. You're a true nurse, a true healer, and this world is better because of you. I hope you never stop fighting for those who need you. With all my love and gratitude, Clara."